Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Atheist Delusions by David Bentley Hart, critiquing it from my atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to review chapters 6 and 7 of the book. So let's get started with chapter 6, The Death and Rebirth of Science. It's a gross caricature of history, Hart says, to suggest that Christianity took power during a period when the pursuit of science and reason was cherished and immediately put an end to it. He calls the suggestion that there is a war between Christian theology and science mythology of the purest water. So how does he see things then? For one thing, Christianity could not have been an enemy of science, because if it had been, how could those who sparked the scientific revolution have learned the fundamentals they eventually built upon? The scientific revolution didn't just pop up out of nowhere, after all. For example, quote, Copernicus, having matriculated at a number of Christian universities, was heir to a long tradition of Christian scholastic, mathematical, and theoretical work in astronomy and the science of motion, stretching back at least to the early 13th century. But for this tradition, his thought would have had no theoretical basis. Hart adds that for centuries, both Christians and Muslims held firmly to Ptolemy's geocentric model of the universe, which was itself based on principles first popularized by Aristotle. He likens the Ptolemaic model of the universe to a beautiful cage in which virtually every intellect was confined prior to the scientific revolution, and he considers it unfair for us to accuse the church of being responsible for that confinement, because the Ptolemaic model and before that the Aristotelian model were not the products of the church. And anyway, what was so great about Copernicus? His heliocentric model failed to catch on with his colleagues, not because of any suppression by the church, Hart says, but because it just wasn't much of an improvement on the Ptolemaic model in terms of simplicity or predictive power. Tycho Brahe, one of Copernicus's successors, came up with a superior model, although Tycho's version retained Earth as the stationary center but had the other planets orbiting the sun. Well, notice that Hart insists that widely held human values like charity, compassion, and love of peace are the exclusive property of Christianity, as he has suggested in previous chapters I've looked at. But here, he knows that geocentrism isn't Christianity's fault. Isn't that interesting? The universal human values, all those belong to Christianity. But geocentrism, which the church promoted and maintained as the only acceptable view of the universe within realms it controlled for centuries, sometimes at pain of death, that's not Christianity's fault. That's not. He wants everybody to know that that isn't original to Christianity. Those human values, charity, compassion, love of peace, those are Christianity's and nobody else's. But geocentrism, no. Make sure that everybody knows that's not ours. But that aside, Hart isn't being unreasonable in what he's saying here, except to the extent that he downplays the church's role in blocking acceptance of the Copernican model. It's true that Copernicus's model of the universe is more valuable for the later work it inspired. And it's true that Copernicus's model retained the notion that there were celestial spheres, which Ptolemy also said. And it's true that Copernicus got some other things wrong, such as his assumption that the orbits of the planets were circular. That kind of screwed up astronomers for quite a few centuries, because they couldn't get their calculations to make sense, because everybody assumed that the orbits of planets would be perfectly circular, and of course they're not. They are elliptical. And to Hart's larger point, it's true that Copernicus was not just inventing astronomy out of thin air, but building on an existing tradition that had been maintained under the influence of Christianity in Christian universities. But while Hart is right to argue that the church didn't erase science during the first half of the second millennium, I think it's fair to say that the church definitely had a hand in arresting its progress. In the case of Copernicus, that arresting influence wasn't exercised overtly until many decades after Copernicus's death. And in fact, Copernicus's heliocentric theory wasn't actually published until the year he died. So Copernicus himself would probably not have been around for the backlash if it had come much sooner anyway. But even though that arresting influence of the church was not exercised until long after Copernicus's theory was published and Copernicus himself was dead, I kind of think it should still count. The first major response to Copernicus's heliocentric theory from within the church came from Giovanni Maria Tolosani, but Tolosani's objections weren't published at the time, and they were intended to defend Ptolemy's theory, which Tolosani considered to be the truth, not to accuse Copernicus of having been a heretic for violating the teachings of Scripture or for something like that. That sort of objection, the objection that these works were heretical in some way, wouldn't come along until Galileo was being persecuted 3/4 of a century after Copernicus. And on the subject of Galileo, Hart has this to say, quote, "It is, needless to say, something of an embarrassment that Galileo was forced to renounce the Copernican theory and to end his days comfortably confined to a villa in the hills outside Florence, but not because of what this tells us about Christianity's relation to science. A single instance of institutional purblindness and internal dissension, which was entirely anomalous within the larger history of the Catholic Church's relation to the natural sciences, reveals nothing significant about Christian culture or Christian history as a whole, but demonstrates only how idiotic a conflict between men of titanic egotism can become." Something of an embarrassment. A single instance of institutional purblindness, entirely anomalous. Sure, what happened to Galileo was regrettable, but come on, let's not go overboard here. It wasn't house arrest. It was comfortable confinement. And the case isn't typical of the institution's overall relationship to science, said institution being the Catholic Church. 33 years before Galileo was sentenced to house arrest, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for after being convicted by the Inquisition for holding opinions contrary to the Church, including his suggestion that the sky contained many worlds orbiting their own suns. Afterwards, Bruno's books were banned by the Church. Okay, so maybe the house arrest of Galileo and the execution by immolation of Bruno don't reflect the Church's overall attitude towards science. Scientist burnings were not all that common back then. But even so, the Church was only a friend to science that it judged to be compatible with its own teachings. And that is ultimately the problem. It's not that the Church burned or arrested every single scientist it considered a heretic. It's that it used the threat of heresy to silence scientists and scientific ideas it didn't like. And if Hart wants to argue that the Church didn't do that, I would beg to differ. The intolerance of the Inquisition is legendary, but that's only one example. The Society of Jesus, which is also known as the Jesuits, the Catholic organization centered on education and intellectual pursuits, selected a council called the Revisers General, whose task it was to review science and philosophy and determine what was acceptable and what wasn't. In attempting to defend Christianity's relationship with science in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, Hart reminds us that the great European scientists and philosophers of the time were Christians, and they were educated in Christian schools, taught by Christian professors. His intent is to show that Christianity can't possibly be anti-science because all the great scientists were Christians. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, that's never been the argument. The argument isn't that no Christians of that time period were scientifically literate or interested in discovering and exploring new ideas. The argument is that the Church and Christian culture in general that was heavily influenced by the Church discouraged and, in some cases, punished people for promoting new ideas of which it didn't approve. And since in those days the Church and the state were, for all practical purposes, the same thing, that meant the Church had the final say in deciding which ideas were allowed and which weren't. Hart would argue very vociferously, as he does in this chapter and the next, that the church authorities and the secular authorities were different things, and that is true. But the Inquisition handed people over to the secular authorities to be executed, and then they were. So I think there's a little bit of a connection there, if you'll pardon me saying so. Imagine that a scientist working at a creationist organization today, like the Discovery Institute, has an epiphany one day, and this scientist realizes that the theory of evolution is true after all. And he writes a paper on the subject and submits it for publication. And Ken Ham, the head of the Discovery Institute, finds out about it, refuses to publish the paper, and fires the scientist. Well, it sucks for that scientist, and it doesn't say much for the Discovery Institute's commitment to science, but so what, right? It's just the Discovery Institute, and it doesn't really have any effect on the broader culture. Seems like the Discovery Institute would be a pretty shitty place to work if you were a scientist. But now imagine that the Discovery Institute is an organ of the most powerful and influential organization in this part of the world. So powerful that it can dictate not only the culture, but the actions of the state. A society where there is no separation of church and state, where one group of people can co-opt the power of the state and use it to silence voices it deems to be heretical and dangerous, is not a society that values science. It cannot be. And the fact that the scientific principles the church found acceptable and that it was willing to go to extreme lengths in some cases, like house arrest or execution by burning to defend, were not originally Christian but Aristotelian, is completely irrelevant. Whether the church's preferred cosmology came from Aristotle or Ptolemy or directly from the pages of the Bible, the church had a cosmological model that it considered correct, and any proposed model that contradicted it was deemed intolerable. It was not allowed for a scientist to say of the accepted model, maybe that's wrong. That is not an institution that supports science. That is an institution that stifles science. Hart also acknowledges that the church's view of Scripture at the time of Galileo was misguided, that the Bible should not be read as a science book. And then he spends a page or two discussing how egotistical and jealous and difficult to get along with Galileo apparently was. Quote, "More importantly, though, and too often forgotten, Urban, meaning Pope Urban, was essentially right on one very crucial issue. The Copernican model was in fact only a hypothesis, and a defective one at that, and Galileo did not have either sufficient evidence to support it or a mathematical model that worked particularly well." All of which, again, is beside the point. It doesn't matter why the church deemed Galileo's views unacceptable. It doesn't matter if Galileo was the biggest asshole in Florence. It doesn't matter if Galileo and Copernicus were wrong about everything they ever said. Nor does it matter, by the way, how many brilliant and innovative scientists of the era were Christians, or how much better those Christians were able to understand the world than their classical pagan predecessors, because Hart makes that argument in several pages of this chapter. No one seriously argues that there were not Christians of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance who were brilliant scientists. But none of that matters in this context. It matters that the church decided that it had the right to decide what ideas were acceptable and what ideas were not acceptable. And it used the power of the state to enforce those decisions. Were there revolutionary scientific advances made while the church was in power? Yes. Did the church persecute every scientist who came up with a revolutionary idea? No. Hart references Kepler, who was not persecuted by the church for his ideas. But is it a coincidence that as scientific literacy increased and the picture painted by science began to diverge further and further from the one presented by the church, to the point that eventually, to educated people, it just became undeniable that the church's preferred view was not the correct view? Is it a coincidence that as that continued to happen, the influence of the church, especially in intellectual circles, began to wane? Maybe that is a coincidence, but I don't think so. Moving on to chapter 7, which is titled Intolerance and Persecution. Having spent much of the previous chapter arguing that the oppressive attitude of the medieval and Renaissance Catholic Church toward the sciences shouldn't be counted against Christianity because of the scientific accomplishments of Christians at the time, Hart now switches to downplay the, you guessed it from the chapter title, intolerance and persecution of the 16th and 17th century Christians. He says, quote, certain charges are more easily dismissed than others. As entertaining as it might be, for instance, to think of the Middle Ages as a time of inquisitors burning thousands of witches at the stake, it was not until the early modern period, especially from the late 16th century through the middle of the 17th, that a great enthusiasm for hunting out and prosecuting witches sprang up in various regions of Western Europe. And over 3 centuries, from, say, the middle of the 15th century to the middle of the 18th, claimed anywhere from 30,000 to 60,000 lives, though not generally at the prompting of or with the approval of the Catholic Church. So in the last chapter, Hart argues against the perception that Christendom at the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance was anti-science because science was taught in Christian universities and great discoveries were made by Christians who pursued the sciences, and ignores the extremely oppressive, antagonistic attitude of the Church towards science that it deemed unacceptable. Now, in this chapter, Hart seeks to minimize the importance of those 30,000 to 60,000 people, according to him, who were killed by witch hunters because, according to him, the Catholic Church didn't approve of such witch hunts. What, generally speaking, was the religion, do you suppose, of the Europeans who participated in those witch hunts that killed as many as 60,000 people? My guess would be some form of Christianity. Why does Christian society get credit for its scientists, but escape blame for its witch hunters? Is there any way that makes sense apart from the shameless bias of Hart? Hart argues that the Catholic Church worked to discourage belief in witches and other superstitions for centuries. Well, that being the case, what was up with all the witch hunts? Quote, precisely why a new fascination with sorcery and demonolatry arose in the twilight of the Middle Ages and became so epidemic in the early modern period, it is difficult to say. Certain traditional explanations concern such things as the emotional effects of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, or the anxiety created by the once unthinkable erosion of the religious unity of Catholic Europe, or other vague social pathologies impossible to quantify. Perhaps, one might say, even more imprecisely, it belonged to the tenor of the times to desire some outsider or other to fear and hate. Well, thank goodness that was just the tenor of those times. Can you imagine what it would be like if we still felt that way? Why does he put emotional and anxiety in quotes, by the way? As if people didn't really feel that way. Here's another quote where Hart attempts to explain the witch hunts and the rise of superstition despite the Church's noble efforts to oppose those things. Quote, another line of reasoning connects the late medieval belief in secret diabolistic cults to the rise of new heresies in Western Europe during the age of the Crusades, and especially to the rise of the Cathar Church in the south of France and Italy during the 12th and 13th centuries. This was arguably, after all, the gravest crisis the political and ecclesiastical institutions of medieval Europe ever suffered. It was the spread of Catharism that eventually led to the Pope instituting the first Inquisition and approving the use of torture. This laid the foundation, Hart says, for the witch hunts. Oh, and it was Dominican monks who wrote the Malleus Maleficarum, the book that did more than any other volume to spread paranoia about witchcraft. But, on the other hand, the Church did more to discourage belief in witchcraft and sorcery than those scientists did. Quote, more significantly, perhaps, some of the great early theorists of modern science and scientific method were believers in magic, and consequently were often willing to prescribe the prosecution of those who used it for maleficent ends. Rodney Stark is not overstating his case when he declares the first significant objections to the reality of satanic witchcraft came from Spanish inquisitors, not from scientists. So, what is Hart saying here? That things were better when the church had the power to steer the state? It sounds like that's what he's saying. But he says that's not what he's saying. In fact, later in this chapter, he laments that the church ever became involved in what he calls temporal politics. So, if, as Hart also says in this chapter, the state is inherently violent, and many of the abuses blamed on the church, execution of witches and heretics, initiation of the Inquisitions, were in fact due to the secular authorities influencing the church rather than the other way around, why does he lament the church ever getting involved? He depicts the church as an essentially noble, humane institution that occasionally went astray when it foolishly allowed itself to be led by the secular state. That being the case, why wouldn't he want it to have an influence on the state? He's saying things were better when it did exercise such influence, right? I'm pretty sure he is. It's apparent to me that Hart's perspective allows him to view the church as an imperfect but essentially blameless institution. Here, I'll let him say it himself. Quote, "The Age of Enlightenment, considered in purely political terms, was itself merely the transition from one epoch of nationalist warfare, during which states still found it necessary to use religious institutions as instruments of power, to another epoch of still greater nationalist warfare, during which religious rationales had become obsolete because the state had become its own cult, and power the only morality." So religious institutions aren't really to blame for the wars and other abuses in which they involved themselves, because they were just being exploited by the state. Here's the thing. I don't think that the witch hunts and the inquisitions and the persecution of heretical scientists are 100% the fault of Christianity. And some atheists will probably disagree with me on that. There are quite a few atheists who seem to want to blame Christianity and religion in general 100% for all of the awful things that religious institutions were ever involved in, as though religion was the one and only cause of all of these crimes and atrocities. I don't think there's anything inherent to Christianity that makes people do such things. Plenty of Christians find violence and religious persecution abhorrent, and many of those Christians cite their faith as a motivation to avoid such things, to not be cruel, to not commit violence. And there were Christians living before the Enlightenment who felt the same way, including people who worked in the church. It's not that Christianity causes any of these abuses. It's that it doesn't necessarily prevent them, though many Christians seem to believe it does. Being a Christian might encourage you to be a more ethical and tolerant person, if the version of Christianity you follow is ethical and tolerant. Being a Christian might also encourage you to be an intolerant bigot, if the version of Christianity you follow is bigoted and intolerant. In this chapter, Hart writes of the inherent power of the gospel to influence society, but such power isn't unique to the gospel and isn't inherent. Many works of literature and art and science have influenced societies for good and bad. It's not the works themselves, it's how people respond to them. And the same is true of secular governments. Hart's argument is that modernity arrived, the influence of the church, which again he confusingly laments when it comes to politics, weakened, and the level of state violence rose significantly. But how much of that is the fault of secularism? Sadly, secular institutions are not necessarily less tribal than religious ones, nor are they less vulnerable to corruption. The point Hart misses is that a church and a secular government are both human-made institutions, and thus only as good as the humans who operate them. That being the case, why is a secular state better than a religious one? Well, for one thing, because true religious liberty is impossible under a religious state. There can be no equality while one group reserves for itself the power to make the rules by which members of all the other groups must live. Even if the church were as noble and well-intentioned as Hart thinks it is, there is no moral justification for allowing a Christian church or any other particular church the privilege of controlling the government of a nation. No church should have the power to impose its rules on members of other churches or on those who belong to no church or profess no religious belief at all. Hart believes his church should have that right, thinks we were better off when his church had that right, and resents modernity for taking that right away from his church. For another thing, despite the unspeakable horrors to which secular states have contributed in the last few centuries, wars, genocide, oppression, and violence against their own citizens and those of other states, it wasn't until the Age of Enlightenment, when studies of science, art, philosophy, and ethics became independent of religious institutions, that transformative socio-political movements began to appear and to reshape their societies. Christianity was the dominant cultural force in Europe for a millennium and a half, but we never had the abolition of slavery, the black civil rights movement, feminism, the labor movement, the LGBTQ movement, or any of the other revolutionary social justice movements that have changed much of the world for the better these last 200 years, until Christianity and other religions were forced to take a back seat to and allow themselves to be influenced by the values of secular humanism. While certainly not incompatible with certain versions of Christianity, the U.S. Constitution is not a Christian document. The Bill of Rights is not a Christian document. The Seneca Falls Convention's Declaration of Sentiments is not a Christian document. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not a Christian document. These documents and the values they articulate are not anti-Christian. They are not incompatible with Christianity, but they don't belong to Christianity. They don't belong to any one religion. They don't claim to derive their authority from God or Scripture or any ecclesiastical source. And their principles can be recognized and cherished and upheld by anyone, regardless of their religious belief or lack thereof. And that is one of the great achievements of this modernity at which Hart so snidely turns up his nose. The realization that all people should have rights, that all people should be treated with fairness and justice, that all people deserve to have their basic human dignity recognized and respected, and that such recognition and respect should not emanate from any proposed deity or any church that claims to speak for that deity or any interpretation of any teaching in any scripture, but from the people themselves. Hart wants society to be influenced by his religion and his religion alone. Instead, modernity and secularism have seen the prestige and influence of his religion and the religion of many other people slowly but steadily diminish. And that resentment toward the growing irrelevance of his church in the context of society as a whole is what I suspect is behind all of this with David Bentley Hart, but I could be wrong. We will continue to explore this issue in the next video in the series. That is it for this video. In the next episode, I will be taking a look at the next 2 chapters of the book, and those would be Chapter 8, Intolerance and War, and Chapter 9, An Age of Darkness. Please do join me for that. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, if you found it of some use, please like, share, subscribe, leave a comment. Let me know if I got something right, if I got something wrong. What were your thoughts on what I had to say here? Be you atheist, Christian, or a believer or non-believer of any stripe at all. I look forward to hearing your response to what I've had to say here. And most importantly, please consider, if you have enjoyed this and found this to be of some use to you, helping me to make more videos like this by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to support the work I do on this channel, these videos, and all the videos I produce for as little as $1 a month. So please do consider that if you can afford it and if you think I'm worth it. That's it, everybody. Thanks for watching. See you next time.